There is a number, not a goal, not a milestone, a threshold, a specific quantity beneath which the physics of capital accumulation operate one way, and above which they operate an entirely different way. Most people saving money do not know this number exists. They have been told that saving is linear, that every dollar added is one step further along the same path, that discipline compounding over time will eventually produce a different life. They save carefully, incrementally, faithfully. The number in the account grows, slowly, and the life feels exactly the same. This is not a failure of discipline. This is what happens when you are operating below the threshold. Rockefeller did not build storage tanks. He built refineries. There is a specific reason for that distinction, and it is the entire argument here. Raw crude sitting in a tank does not become more valuable by sitting longer. It does not refine itself. It does not generate output. It waits. The refinery is what changes the physics, what takes crude and turns it into something that moves through a pipeline, reaches a market, and returns capital to the source. But the refinery has a minimum input requirement. Below a certain quantity of crude, it cannot run. The mechanism requires a threshold quantity before the process can begin. Below that number, you are not refining. You are storing. The first $10,000 is not the 10th step on a long staircase. It is the minimum quantity of crude required to enter the refinery. What follows is about what happens at that threshold, why the physics change, what the change produces, and why every dollar saved before that number is not wasted, but is also not yet inside the machine that builds wealth. You will not be inspired by the end of this. You will be oriented. That is more useful. You have been saving for 18 months. The discipline is real. The sacrifice is real. The number in the account is real, and it is larger than it was, which means the process is working. By the only measure you have been given, you are doing everything correctly. And yet something does not feel right. The number grows, but slowly. The life around the number has not changed. The breathing room you expected, the sense that the foundation is shifting beneath you, has not arrived. And so you do what disciplined people do when the process feels insufficient. You question whether you are saving enough, whether the rate is fast enough, whether you are behind. You are not behind. You are below the threshold. These are not the same condition, and the distinction matters structurally, not just emotionally. Being behind implies the problem is pace, that you need to move faster along the same path. Being below a threshold implies the problem is position, that the path does not change in character until a specific condition is met. The condition has a name, the physics have a shape, and once you understand both, the number in your account, whatever it is today, stops being a source of quiet frustration and becomes something more precise, a known distance from the point at which the mechanism changes. Not how to save faster, not a strategy. The structure beneath the strategy. The reason the first $10,000 is not simply more of what came before it, but a different kind of event entirely. Rockefeller understood thresholds. He understood them in oil. The minimum volume required to justify a pipeline. The minimum throughput required to make a refinery economically viable. The minimum scale at which the cost structure inverts and the operation begins to compound rather than simply survive. He applied this thinking to capital with the same precision he applied it to crude. The refinery does not begin running because you want it to. It begins running when the threshold is met. Every physical system has a minimum operating condition, not a preference, not an ideal, a floor, a quantity below which the mechanism cannot engage. Below that floor, you can have all the correct components, all the correct intent, all the correct structure, and the machine will not run. Not because something is broken, because the input is insufficient to initiate the process. This is the Bedrock Threshold. In Rockefeller's world, it was crude. A refinery is a capital-intensive structure. The pipes, the heat, the separation mechanisms, the output channels. Building and operating that structure has a fixed cost that exists regardless of throughput. If the volume of crude entering the refinery is below the level required to cover that fixed cost and generate surplus, the operation does not break even. it consumes. You are paying the cost of running the refinery without generating the output that justifies it. Below a certain volume, the crude is better left in the ground than refined at a loss. Rockefeller did not run refineries below minimum viable throughput. He either reached the threshold or he did not operate. This was not impatience, it was structural clarity. He understood that below the threshold, the mechanics do not apply. You are in a different regime entirely. Capital has the same property. The Bedrock threshold in personal capital accumulation is the minimum quantity at which capital begins to generate returns that are structurally meaningful. Returns that compound, that interact with themselves, that produce a second-order effect on the original position. Below this threshold, capital generates returns that are real in absolute terms but insufficient in structural terms. The interest on $800 is not nothing. But it is not refining. It is crude sitting in a tank, generating a small accounting entry, while the refinery stands idle because the minimum input has not been met. $10,000 is the threshold. Not an arbitrary number, a structural one. The approximate quantity at which the geometry of compounding becomes visible within a human time horizon, at which access to instruments that generate meaningful return becomes practically available, at which the capital itself begins to exert a gravitational effect on additional capital. Below 10,000, you are saving. Above 10,000, the physics change. Below the Bedrock threshold, every dollar in the account is inert in the structural sense. It is stored value. It is crude in a tank. The balance grows only through the one mechanism available to it, your continued contribution. You add $100, the balance increases by $100. You add $200, the balance increases by $200. The relationship is direct, linear, and entirely dependent on your ongoing input. The moment you stop adding, the growth stops. The mechanism is you. This is the critical structural distinction. Above the threshold, the mechanism is no longer only you. When capital reaches a position where its own return begins to contribute meaningfully to its growth, the input requirement changes. Your contribution still matters, but it is no longer the only engine. The capital begins to participate in its own accumulation. The return on the existing position adds to the base. The next period's return is calculated on the larger base. The curve begins, slowly, invisibly at first, to pull away from the line that direct contribution alone would produce. This is not compound interest as a concept. This is compound interest as a physical event that you can observe happening to a specific quantity of capital over a specific period. Below the threshold, you cannot observe this event, because below the threshold, the return is too small relative to your contribution to be distinguishable from the contribution itself. The interest on $3,000 at a 5% annual return is $150 per year, $12.50 per month. Against a monthly contribution of $200, this is noise. It exists. It is real. But it is structurally invisible. It does not change the mechanics of how the account grows, because the account is still growing almost entirely through your effort. This is still the treadmill. The machine's contribution is $12. Your contribution is $200. You are the engine. At $10,000, the return at 5% is $500 per year. $41 per month, still modest, but now occupying a different structural position relative to your contribution. Now visible as a force, small, but directionally distinct from zero. Now the beginning of the condition that produces the next stage. At $20,000, the return is $1,000 per year. The curve has begun to separate from the line. At $50,000, the return is $2,500 per year. The capital is now contributing in a way that is structurally significant, that changes the arithmetic of how quickly additional thresholds are reached. The curve does not become dramatic until it is given time and a base to work from. The Bedrock threshold is the minimum base. Below it, the curve cannot begin, not because saving is wrong, but because the refinery requires a minimum quantity of crude before it can run. Every dollar saved below the threshold is crude being extracted and stored. It is necessary work. The crude must be extracted before it can be refined. The discipline must be built before the threshold can be reached. Nothing about the period below the threshold is wasted. It is the extraction phase, and it is load-bearing. Without it, the refinery never runs, but it must be understood for what it is. Extraction is not refining. Storage is not output. Patience below the threshold is not the same structural act as patience above it. Because above the threshold, patience allows the mechanism to work. Below it, patience only allows the storage to continue filling. Rockefeller was not patient about storage. He was patient about refinement. He distinguished between the two because the distinction determined everything about how capital was deployed and how time was spent. You are in the extraction phase. The refinery is waiting. The threshold is the only target that changes the physics. There is a moment in the accumulation of capital that almost no one has described accurately. Not the moment you reach a large number. Not the moment you feel financially secure. A specific structural moment, earlier than both of those, when the direction of gravitational force on your capital reverses. Below the Bedrock threshold, capital behaves like crude stored in an open tank in a field. Gravity works against it, not metaphorically, but structurally. Every force in the economic environment is oriented toward removing it. Inflation erodes its purchasing power. Consumption pressure extracts it. Emergencies draw it down. The cost of living rises around it, and critically, because it is below the threshold at which it can generate meaningful return. It cannot defend itself against these forces through its own motion. It sits. The world moves around it in ways that reduce its effective value daily. You have to run to keep it full. This is the gravity reversal, the structural event that occurs when capital crosses the Bedrock threshold and the directional force changes. Above the threshold, for the first time, capital begins to exert gravitational pull rather than simply experiencing it. It begins to attract additional capital, not through effort, not through additional contribution, but through the structural property of capital in motion. The return generates a base that generates a larger return. The position begins to pull toward itself. Rockefeller understood gravitational dynamics in oil the way physicists understand them in space. A small object in isolation drifts. A sufficiently massive object begins to pull other objects toward it. He was not interested in small objects drifting. He was interested in building mass until the gravitational property engaged, until the position was large enough that the market, the competition, the capital of others began to orient toward it rather than away from it. He did not achieve this through effort alone. He achieved it through threshold. The gravity reversal in personal capital operates on the same principle, scaled to the individual rather than the industrial. The physics are identical. Below the threshold, your relationship to your savings is extractive in the defensive sense. You are the source. You contribute. The account receives. The account's only growth mechanism is your next contribution. This means that any interruption to your contribution, any month where the emergency absorbs the savings allocation, any period where income decreases, produces an immediate and direct impact on the balance. There is no buffer. There is no inertia in the position. The account is entirely dependent on your active maintenance. Above the threshold, the account acquires inertia. Not enough inertia to be invulnerable. Nothing at the early stages of capital accumulation is invulnerable, but enough that a month without contribution does not arrest the growth entirely. The position's own return continues, small, but present, and the presence of that return, the knowledge that the account is growing even in months when you cannot add to it, changes something structural about the relationship between the saver and the savings. This is the first form of the gravity reversal, from complete dependence on input to partial independence from it. The second form is more significant. Above the Bedrock threshold, capital begins to interact differently with instruments that generate return. This is a practical mechanical point, not an abstract one. Certain investment structures, instruments, vehicles, positions that generate returns above the rate of inflation, have minimum entry requirements. Not moral requirements, physical ones. A brokerage account that requires a minimum balance to access certain instruments. a position that requires a minimum lot size to execute, an investment vehicle that requires a minimum quantity to participate. Below the threshold, these instruments are inaccessible, not because of policy, but because the capital is insufficient to engage them at the structural level at which they generate meaningful return. The crude below threshold quantity cannot enter the refinery. The refinery does not have a smaller setting for smaller batches. It either runs or it does not. Above the threshold, the range of positions available to the capital expands. The capital can reach instruments it could not reach before, and those instruments generate returns that, applied back to the growing base, accelerate the rate at which the next threshold is approached. This is the compounding of access, not just the compounding of return. Access compounds. Each threshold reached opens positions unavailable below it. Each position open generates return that builds toward the next threshold. The progression is not linear. It accelerates because the gravitational force increases with mass. The third form of the gravity reversal is psychological in its surface appearance but structural in its origin. Below the threshold, saving requires active maintenance of a belief that the process is working, because the evidence that the process is working is too small to be felt without deliberate attention. You must decide, every month, to continue contributing, without visceral confirmation that the contribution is doing what it is supposed to do. This is not weakness. This is the mechanical reality of operating below the threshold. The returns are too small to provide structural feedback. The discipline must be self-sustaining because the account cannot yet sustain it. Above the threshold, the account begins to provide its own evidence. Not dramatically, not in ways that change behavior overnight, but the return, now visible, now structurally distinguishable from the contribution, begins to confirm the mechanism. You do not need to decide to believe the process is working. You can observe that the process is working. The crude is entering the refinery. The output is moving through the pipeline. The position is generating return. Rockefeller kept his ledger not as an act of discipline, but as an act of observation. He wanted to see the mechanism operating. He wanted the evidence in numbers, not in faith. The ledger confirmed what the structure was doing. The confirmation made continued patience not an act of will but a logical response to observed arithmetic. Above the Bedrock threshold, the ledger begins to confirm the mechanism. Below it, the ledger shows only what you have put in. This is the gravity reversal. Not a moment of celebration, not an arrival. A structural shift in the direction of force. From capital that requires constant defense against a world that extracts it, to capital that begins to participate in its own accumulation. The threshold is the pivot point. Every dollar below it is crude in a tank. Every dollar above it is crude at the refinery gate. The gate matters, not because anything dramatic happens the moment you cross it, but because on the other side of it, the physics are different. And different physics, applied to the same discipline over the same period of time, produce outputs that are geometrically unlike anything the period below the threshold produced. The refinery is not waiting for you to work harder. It is waiting for the minimum input. The refinery is running, not at full capacity, not producing the volume it will eventually produce. But the minimum input has been met, the mechanism has engaged, and for the first time in the accumulation process, the physics are operating in a different direction than they were before. The question changes. Below the threshold, the question was, how do I reach the threshold? The answer was extraction and storage, disciplined contribution, protected capital, the patient work of filling the tank to the minimum quantity required. Above the threshold, that question is no longer the primary one. A new question takes its place, not how to save, not how to contribute, but how to operate the refinery, how to keep crude entering the mechanism, how to ensure the output is returned to the position rather than consumed, and how to allow the process sufficient time to reach the stage at which its own motion becomes the dominant force. This is the compound engine, not a concept borrowed from finance textbooks. A mechanical description of what capital in correct position does when it is given time and not interrupted. The engine, once running, does not require increasing effort to increase output. It requires maintenance of conditions. The crude must keep entering. The output must be returned to the base rather than extracted and spent. The mechanism must be protected from the structural forces that would disrupt it, the emergency that liquidates the position, the consumption pressure that bleeds the return before it can compound, the impatience that mistakes the early invisibility of the curve for evidence that the curve is not there. Rockefeller's refineries did not produce maximum output on the first day of operation. They produced minimum viable output. The economics of the early operation were modest. The margins were real but thin. The volume was sufficient to sustain the mechanism, but not yet sufficient to generate the surplus that would fund expansion. The early refinery was not the destination, it was the proof of concept, evidence that the mechanism worked, foundation for the scale that followed. The compound engine in personal capital operates identically. The first year above the Bedrock Threshold does not feel like wealth. It feels like more saving, because the contribution is still the dominant input, and the return, though now structurally distinguishable, is not yet large enough to change the texture of daily financial life. The account grows. The rate of growth is slightly faster than it was below the threshold. The difference is real but not dramatic. This is the point at which the mechanism is misread. They cross the threshold. They observe that the feeling has not changed dramatically. They conclude incorrectly that the threshold was not meaningful, that the physics did not change, that the curve is not there, that the promises of compound interest were overstated. The curve is there. It is simply in the early stage of its geometry, the stage that looks nearly identical to linear accumulation, because the compounding has not yet had sufficient time and base to separate visibly from the line that direct contribution alone would produce. The arithmetic of the engine stated precisely. At $10,000 compounding at 7% annually. A conservative return available through broadly diversified equity positions, not speculative instruments. The return in year 1 is $700. A contribution of $200 per month adds $2,400. The account ends year 1 at approximately $13,100. Year 2, the return is not $700. It is $917, because the base has grown. The contribution is the same. The engine's contribution has increased because the base increased. Year 5, the account, with consistent contribution and uninterrupted compounding, sits at approximately $27,000. The engine's annual contribution, the return on the position, has grown to nearly $1,900 per year. The engine is now contributing more than the return on the original threshold amount alone could produce. The base has grown. The return has grown with it. Year 10, the account approaches $55,000. The engine's annual contribution exceeds $3,800. The contribution of 1 month of the engine's return now exceeds what the engine's entire first year of operation produced. The curve has separated from the line. Not because anything changed about the mechanism, because the mechanism was allowed to run. This is the compound engine's fundamental property. It does not accelerate through additional input. It accelerates through uninterrupted operation. The crude must keep entering. The output must be returned to the base. Time must be allowed to do what time does to a geometric function, separate it, visibly and then dramatically, from the linear function it briefly resembled at the start. Rockefeller did not achieve industrial scale by working harder at the refinery level. He achieved it by reinvesting the output of each refinery into the next position, by treating every unit of return not as profit to be extracted and consumed, but as crude for the next stage of the mechanism. The output of the first refinery funded the second. The output of the second funded the third. The positions multiplied not through additional effort, but through the structural discipline of returning output to the engine rather than removing it. This is the operating principle of the compound engine. It is the one principle that separates the person who reaches the threshold and stays there from the person who reaches the threshold and begins to build above it. The return must be returned. This sounds obvious. It is structurally rare. The pressure to extract the return, to consume the output of the position rather than return it to the base, is structural, not personal. The same forces that made accumulation difficult below the threshold do not disappear above it. Consumption pressure does not subside because the account has crossed $10,000. The cost of living does not reduce. Emergencies do not stop occurring. The temptation to treat the return as available income, as a reward for the discipline that produced it, is real and constant. Rockefeller had a phrase for this. He described the compulsion to spend current returns as the act of eating your seed corn. The farmer who eats the grain intended for next season's planting satisfies a current hunger and destroys a future harvest. The capital that is consumed rather than compounded satisfies a current pressure and arrests the engine. The engine is not resilient to extraction. In the early stages, in the years immediately above the Bedrock Threshold, when the return is real but the base is still modest, repeated extraction of the return does not merely slow the engine. It effectively resets the regime. Capital below the threshold that is repeatedly drawn down does not compound. It oscillates. It approaches the threshold and retreats. The refinery gate opens and closes without the mechanism ever fully engaging. This is the pattern you may recognize. The account grows to a certain level. Something happens. The account reduces. The account grows again. The same level is reached. The same extraction occurs. The number oscillates in a range rather than climbing a curve. Not because the discipline is insufficient. Because the output is not being returned to the base. The compound engine requires one operating condition above all others: that the return be treated as input rather than output. That the crude the refinery produces be fed back into the refinery rather than removed and sold at the gate. This requires a specific structural decision, not a motivational one, about how the return is classified in the personal financial ledger. Is the return available income, or is it part of the engine's operating mass? Rockefeller's ledger answered this question without ambiguity. Return on capital was capital. It was not income to be spent. It was positioned to be compounded. The distinction was not about self-denial. It was about understanding what the return was structurally, where it belonged in the mechanism, what it would become if left in place, what it would fail to become if removed. Your savings account interest is not a reward. It is crude entering the refinery. The second operating condition of the compound engine. The engine compounds what is in position, not what is in storage. The distinction between position and storage, between capital deployed in an instrument that generates return above the rate at which inflation erodes purchasing power, and capital held in a form that simply preserves its face value, is the difference between the engine running and the engine idling. Below the Bedrock Threshold, this distinction is partially suspended. The capital is not yet at the level where deployment options that generate meaningful return are practically accessible, and the priority is correctly preservation and accumulation rather than deployment. The crude must be extracted and stored before the refinery can run. Storage is the correct activity below the threshold. Above the threshold, storage is no longer the correct activity. Storage below the threshold was accumulation toward a condition. Storage above the threshold is the failure to engage the mechanism that the threshold makes available. The crude is at the refinery gate. Leaving it in the storage tank is not caution. It is the structural decision, whether deliberate or by inattention, to not run the refinery. The instruments that put capital in position, diversified equity instruments, ownership stakes in productive assets, vehicles that generate yield and return, are not complicated at the scale of the Bedrock Threshold. They do not require sophistication. They require the structural decision to move capital from storage into the mechanism that generates return. The refinery does not require the operator to be a chemist. It requires the operator to open the valve. This is where the Rockefeller model becomes most directly applicable to the individual at the threshold. Rockefeller did not wait until his capital was large enough to build the most sophisticated refinery available. He built the minimum viable refinery at the minimum viable scale, and he ran it. He understood that the value of the refinery was not in its eventual scale but in its operation. An idle refinery of any size produces nothing. A running refinery of minimum size produces output that can be returned to the base, used to expand capacity, used to approach the next threshold. The compound engine at $10,000 is a minimum viable refinery. It is not the destination. It is the proof of concept. It is the first evidence that the mechanism works, evidence that is visible in the return, confirmable in the ledger, observable in the separation of the curve from the line. The destination is the engine running long enough, with enough consistent input and uninterrupted return to base, that the engine's contribution to growth becomes the dominant force, larger than the monthly contribution, larger than the effort of the saver, self-sustaining in a way that effort-based income structurally cannot be. This is the end state of the compound engine, not a number, not a date, a structural condition, the condition in which the position generates more than the contribution, in which the refinery produces more than the crude entering it, in which the engine's motion is the primary engine rather than a supplement to the saver's motion. Rockefeller reached this condition. Every person who has moved from the position of saver to the position of capital owner has passed through the same sequence: extraction, storage, threshold, engagement, compounding, dominance of the engine's return over the contribution. The sequence is not mysterious. It is not reserved for people of unusual intelligence or unusual circumstance. It is physics, applied to capital rather than crude, but governed by the same laws. The laws do not negotiate. The threshold does not move because the saver needs it to be lower. The mechanism does not engage before the minimum input is met. The engine does not accelerate through effort. It accelerates through time and uninterrupted operation. The threshold is reachable, not without the discipline of the extraction phase. The 18 months of contribution that produced the $3,200, and the additional period required to reach the threshold from there, but reachable through the same mechanism that produced the current balance, consistent contribution, protected capital, and the structural understanding of why the threshold, not the account balance at any arbitrary moment, not a feeling of readiness, not an external signal, is the only target that changes the physics. The refinery is not waiting for you to deserve it. It is waiting for the minimum input. The crude is being extracted. The tank is filling. The gate is a known distance away. The refinery has been described, not as an aspiration, as a mechanism. The threshold has a number. The physics have a shape. The engine has an operating principle. None of this is abstract. None of it is dependent on circumstances not available to the person who has been saving carefully for 18 months and watching the balance grow in the only direction balances can grow when you keep contributing to them. You know something now that you did not know when this began. You know that the $3,200 in the account is not behind a destination. It is below a threshold. Those are structurally different conditions. Behind a destination implies the path is the same regardless of where you are on it, that every step is the same kind of step, that progress is continuous and uniform, that patience is the act of continuing what you are already doing until you arrive. Below a threshold implies that the path changes character at a specific point, that the step across the threshold is not the same kind of step as the steps that preceded it, that what waits on the other side is not more of what came before but a different operating regime, different physics, different mechanics, different relationship between the capital and its own accumulation. The Bedrock Threshold is $6,800 away from where you are today. Not an abstraction, a distance, a known quantity of crude that must be extracted and stored before the refinery gate can open. The gravity reversal does not occur before the threshold is met. It occurs at the threshold, when the forces that have been working against the capital's accumulation begin to yield to the forces generated by the capital's own motion. Not immediately, not dramatically, but directionally and permanently. The physics do not reverse back once the threshold is crossed and the position is maintained. The compound engine does not run on intention. It runs on minimum viable input, uninterrupted operation, and the structural discipline of returning the output to the base rather than consuming it at the gate. These are not motivational requirements. They are mechanical ones. The engine is indifferent to how you feel about the process. It responds to what you do with the crude. If the threshold is not reached, the physics do not change. Not as a punishment, as arithmetic. The tank continues to fill at the rate of contribution. The balance grows linearly. The return remains structurally invisible. The extraction phase continues indefinitely. Not because the saver failed, but because the minimum input for a different regime was never reached. The refinery stands at the gate. The crude accumulates in the storage tank. The mechanism waits. If the threshold is reached and the return is extracted, rather than returned to the base, the engine idles. The crude enters the refinery. The output moves through the pipe. And then the output is removed, consumed, spent, allocated to current pressures, before it can be fed back into the mechanism. The refinery runs technically, but it does not build. It processes and releases. The base does not grow at the rate the geometry requires. The curve does not separate from the line, because the base is not accumulating the mass required to separate it. If the threshold is reached and the return is returned to the base, and time is allowed to do what time does to a geometric function, the engine builds. Slowly at first, then at a rate that becomes visible in the ledger, then at a rate that exceeds the contribution, then at a rate that begins to feel, for the first time, like something other than the mechanical consequence of ongoing effort. That is the moment Rockefeller was describing when he said he would rather have 1% of 100 people's efforts than 100% of his own. Not because effort is without value, but because the engine, at sufficient scale and sufficient time, produces more than effort can. You are not at sufficient scale yet. You are $6,800 from the refinery gate. The discipline that produced $3,200 will produce the threshold, the same mechanism, the same contribution, the same protected capital. But now you know what the threshold is, and why it is the only number that changes the physics. The refinery does not run on intention. It runs on crude.